Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eleonora Tafura Ambrosetti. I'm a research fellow with the Russia, Caucasus and Central Asia Center here at ISPI. We're here today to discuss possible ways out of the conflict in Ukraine. We thought about having a new format here at ISPI, a shorter one. We want to provide the audience with sharp insights from the most renowned experts in Europe and Russia. And we have here two excellent experts indeed to talk about possible solutions to this war. I'm joined today by Andrey Kortunov, Director General of RIAC in Moscow, and Sabine Fischer, Senior Fellow at SVP in Berlin. Since we don't have much time, I'll go right to my guests and ask them a few questions. But you are very welcome to send your own questions through our social medias. We'll do our best to also include some of the audience's questions in this discussion. Andrey, you've made clear in the past few weeks your position against the war, but you have also tried to think very hard about possible solutions, concrete proposals to stop this conflict. So I would like to start by asking you to share some of your first assessment, but also your proposed solutions with us.
Thank you, Eleonora. Thank you for inviting me. It's great to see Sabine here. And let me start with saying that I see the major problem in getting closer to some settlement in the fact that no one can afford to lose in this conflict. All sides involved, directly and indirectly, need to have something to declare victory. And to justify everything that has been done by them earlier. If you take Putin, definitely he has to justify his actions. He should say that my goals in Ukraine were met, the mission was accomplished, and we can withdraw, and we can declare victory. But the same applies to Zelensky, maybe even more so, because Zelensky believes that, and rightly so, that Ukraine should win this war. It should repel the Russian aggression and should reinstate itself as a full-fledged sovereign country. I think that the same dilemma exists in the West, because on the one hand, the West does not want to engage in anything that might look as an appeasement policy. It doesn't want to make concessions to Putin. It doesn't want to reward Russia for its behavior. But on the other hand, the West does not want to engage itself directly into the military conflict. It doesn't want this conflict to emerge as a conflict between Russia and the North Atlantic Alliance, or between Russia and the West at large. So any compromise is likely to be imperfect. Any compromise can be questionable in terms of principles. Any compromise is likely to be criticized by many people around. But I think that's the only way to stop the bloodshed, to reach a ceasefire, and hopefully later on to reach a peace agreement. I think that there are very many obstacles on this path. But I do hope that with a degree of flexibility and a degree of political will, we can gradually move to this goal, as imperfect as this compromise is likely to be.
But Andrey, you talk about flexibility. Have you seen some sort of changes in the last few days about flexibility? Because at the beginning, the Kremlin seemed very vocal in stating its demands and not very keen on compromising.
Well, I might be biased in my own way, because, of course, I want this conflict to end as fast as possible. But it seems that there are some glimpses of such flexibility. And it is indicative that the Kremlin no longer includes the so-called denazification into the list of its demands, which might suggest, and I would like to emphasize, it might suggest that a regime change in Kiev is no longer considered to be one of the goals of the Russian operation. Moreover, there has been a statement by press secretary of President Putin that a meeting between Putin and Zelensky cannot be ruled out, and if the meeting is prepared, why not? Again, it is a positive sign, because I recall before too long, there were statements coming out of the Kremlin that Zelensky is just a puppet in the capable hands of the West, and it makes no sense to talk to Zelensky because he is not an independent player, he is not a decision maker. If this shift did happen, I think it might be regarded as a demonstration of certain flexibility. It might have been caused by the unexpected level of the Western sanctions or by the resilience of the Ukrainian resistance. And at the same time, we've heard from Kiev that President Zelensky argued that membership to NATO is not necessarily the only way in which Ukraine can guarantee its security, and that under certain circumstances, a neutral status should not be ruled out. I think if it is the case, it is also a demonstration of a degree of flexibility, and that might open a way for some kind of negotiations going beyond the issue of humanitarian corridors, which are being discussed right now.
So this compromise is reached before many more human lives are lost. Sabine, I would like to ask you the same question, but perhaps from a European point of view, what would be, in your opinion, if not the best case scenario, at least an acceptable solution from Brussels' point of view?
Thank you very much. And also from my side, thank you very much for the invitation. It's always great to be on a panel with Andrey and have a possibility to discuss with him, and also with you, Eleonora. So I'm very happy to be here. Let me, before I come to your question, let me briefly react perhaps also to what Andrey just said, because I slightly disagree with, or I disagree a little bit with his analysis of the conflict, actually, because I think, Andrey, the way you describe the conflict suggests that there are two equal parties to this conflict or war, and I don't really see this. From where I stand, Russia, I see Russia invading Ukraine, and Ukraine desperately trying to defend itself. And I think this makes for a very different structure of the conflict. And I think because of that, it's very difficult to say that Ukraine wants to win this war. Ukraine is trying to defend itself. And I think Ukrainians, including the Ukrainian political leadership, is very much aware that time is running against them, which is why I think, I agree with everything you said on the slight shifts that we see in the Russian position. I think they're still oscillating. We discussed this just now before we started the webinar. Look at Lavrov's press conference yesterday, but I agree with you, there are signs. But I think the proposals for compromise that Zelensky made, actually, before the meeting of the two foreign ministers yesterday, they were much more far-reaching than what we saw from the Russian side. You just listed them. So I think we have a very asymmetric situation here, with one side attacking the other. This makes for a very difficult situation, also with a view to conflict resolution. Also, if you take into account the overpowering military predominance of Russia in this conflict. Eleonora, briefly to your question, honestly, I think it is not for Brussels to say, because Ukraine is a sovereign country. And Ukraine obviously chose to defend itself, and it keeps doing that. And what we saw over the past 2 weeks is actually absolutely, it's really it's unheard of. Nobody expected that. And I think the Ukrainian resistance, including the government, but also the armed forces, and particularly the society, is something that Moscow didn't expect. And this is the reason why the so-called special operation ran into trouble. And this is the reason why we see these slight shifts in Russian position. So I think it's really for Ukraine to decide what a viable compromise could be, and to negotiate this compromise with the Russian side, if that is possible. I mean, I think this will be a very long, protracted and complicated process, but it's really for Ukraine to do that. I mean, the European Union, I think, has made its position clear. And this is a position that has been clear basically from the beginning of this conflict, which was not on the 24th of February this year, but indeed March 2014. We should not forget that. So the European Union supports Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. And this is, where we should take it from, basically following the choices that Ukraine makes in this respect.
You think, Sabine, that if Ukraine accepted to give up the territories in Donbass and to recognize Crimea as part of Russia, the EU would also recognize these territories as either independent or Russian?
Yes, I think the EU would move in that direction. Yes, I mean, this is, it's a very complex issue also, with regard to international law, because obviously this was an illegal annexation. It was an illegal war in the Donbass from the very beginning. So all sides would need to find procedures to make something like that happen. And we're not there. I mean, I think Zelensky made slight hints with regard to the territories in the Donbass, not with regard to Crimea. Again, this is a sovereign Ukrainian decision. But if Ukraine were to move in this direction, then I think the EU would be open to discuss this with Kiev. I mean, it's highly problematic. I repeat that, because both Crimea and Donbass and the war that we see now evolving with incredibly horrible humanitarian consequences are violations of international law. So this is just, this is just very complicated.
Andrey, you had one, probably the most important think tank in Russia, and I remember discussing with you of the difficulty for think tanks both in Russia and in Europe to achieve impact and influence directly the decisions of their governments. So in this context, in this war, we see that at least from the outside, the decisions look like they're taken from an extremely reduced group of people. So I would like you maybe to tell us a little bit more about this decision-making process. Who do you think in the Kremlin can influence the president and possibly help achieve a compromise in this context?
Well, you're absolutely right. We have a very centralized decision-making process in Russia. And I think that for think tanks here, it is even more difficult to find entry points to the system than for think tanks in Europe or in the United States. Definitely, that creates challenges, not only to us, but to the decisions which are being made. My personal take, and I might be dead wrong on that, but my take is that if there is anyone who can have an impact on President Putin's thinking, this someone should come from the outside rather than from the inside. Of course, I can imagine that people who run the economic bloc of the Russian government have a lot of concerns about what will happen to the Russian economy if this situation continues, if there are more sanctions, more economic pressure on Russia. Definitely, this pressure is unprecedented. We haven't seen anything like that. And I think the world has not seen anything like that, at least in the 21st century. So it was difficult to predict such a development and such degree of unity among Western countries. So I can imagine that people are working on the economic side of the government might have their concerns, and they might have suggestions about how to get out of the situation. But I still believe that if there is an influencer, so to say, this influencer should come from out of the country. And we discussed it a couple of times about who would mediate. And there were various ideas about President Erdogan from Turkey or Prime Minister Bennett from Israel. They spoke of Chairman Xi Jinping from China, and we discussed Angela Merkel as a possible mediator. I think that it would be important to have some kind of a shuttle diplomacy between Moscow and Kyiv to start this dialogue, because otherwise I think it would be very difficult for two leaders under the current circumstances to get together and to cut a deal.
Yes, and you mentioned China, and this was actually one question that has just arrived from Giulio. He was asking whether China could be a mediator, but could also be behind Moscow's decision to start the war. How do you think? Do you see this possible? How would you assess Beijing's role?
We don't know what Putin discussed with his Chinese counterparts when he came to Beijing for the opening ceremony of the Olympic Games. And there are speculations whether Putin really informed Chairman Xi about his decision or potential decision or not. But I think that China right now tries to distance itself from the conflict. China is ready to accuse NATO of its allegedly aggressive policies towards Russia, because China is also opposing NATO and specifically the United States. But China doesn't want to take sides in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict because China is a big partner for Russia, but it is also a big partner for Ukraine. It's a major trading partner for Kyiv, and it's a major investor there. So China is reluctant to support Moscow directly in its confrontation with Kyiv. So when you hear statements coming out of Beijing, they call for a peaceful resolution of the conflict. They call for negotiations, very general stuff, nothing really specific that would suggest that China is firmly on the Russian side, though one can argue that in a bigger picture of Russia's confrontation with the West, China is clearly supporting Moscow, not the West.
Thank you. Sabine, we've been talking more and more about the possibility of Ukraine starting officially the EU membership process. How would you assess both the likelihood of this happening, but also the appropriateness? Should Ukraine become a EU member, especially considering that there are a lot of other countries waiting in line?
Yes, thank you. I think, to my mind, rapprochement with the European Union has always been extremely important for Ukraine and also for the European Union. And I think what we see now in Ukraine is of incredible significance also for the future of, European security at large and for the European Union as well. So, as a matter of fact, yes, I think Ukraine should have a European perspective. This idea of having a fast-track accession process is, of course, not realistic, but the EU should, in my view, change its fundamental position with a view to a European or EU perspective for Ukraine. And I think, we all know that Volodymyr Zelensky signed this application for fast track, which actually doesn't exist, fast track accession, a few days back. But I think, again, the Ukrainian side understands very well that this is not a very realistic ambition. The EU perspective, I think, would be a very, very, very important signal also for Ukrainian society in this extremely difficult situation that it finds itself in. And it is true, I mean, you know, this also sheds a different light on other accession processes that are stalled. And I'm talking particularly about the Western Balkans here. I mean, this is indeed, it's a strategic problem. It's a strategic challenge for the European Union. And I think it's essential for the European Union to overcome that challenge and to really advance these accession processes now, because we should see the linkages between, you know, the relationship with the Western Balkans, accession processes there, and the situation with Ukraine. So I think this is really, it's basically a question of the EU's future and position in the wider European security environment. So that would be my answer to that. If I may add one aspect to, or one thought on China. I mean, I absolutely agree with Andrey's analysis. I think it was spot on. I just wanted to add that I think China government, but also banks and companies will do what they can do to fend off negative consequences of Western sanctions against Russia. So I think we will see Chinese actors oscillating here. And trying to basically protect their own interests more than Russian interests, as a matter of fact.
Thank you. Andrey, I'd like to focus on civil society, and I would like you to share with us like your assessment on how this conflict is impacting on ordinary Russians. How's life in Russia after the conflict started?
Well, at this particular juncture, the conflict has affected primarily urbanized middle class, because these people operate with foreign currencies, and of course they were affected by the decline of the exchange rate. The Russian currency has lost, I don't know, maybe more than 30% of its value in dollars. There are also closures of many Western retailers in Moscow. Fast foods are leaving. Of course, there are many people who lose their jobs. So this impact is already visible. And I think that many of these people are confused because they do not know how to react to this situation. However, this impact is less visible in small towns, in rural areas, in some of ethnic republics, because there people do not interact with the outside world as much as, let's say, Muscovites or those living in St. Petersburg do. So I think that the impact on the majority of Russians is delayed. We had a couple of demonstrations. Essentially, in every large city, there are demonstrations protesting against Russia's actions in Ukraine. And I think that most of Russians are sympathetic to Ukrainians. I don't think that there are major anti-Ukrainian feelings. But on the other hand, you can see that some of the most influential or the most popular opposition or liberal media have been shut down, like Dost TV station or let's say Echo Moskvy radio station. So the information that the Russian public receives is censored and clearly incomplete, not to use a different word. And according to sociological polls, the popularity of President Putin has increased, not decreased, but whether we can trust these polls remains to be seen. But my general conclusion is that here a lot depends on how long this conflict lasts for, and what price the country is likely to pay in terms of casualties, in terms of losses among the civilian population, in terms of sanctions impact. And Sabine mentioned that time is playing not on the side of Ukrainians, but I'm not sure that time is playing on the side of Russians either. I think that this operation can be sustained for, I don't know, a couple of weeks, maybe even a couple of months. But if it is a prolonged conflict, it might dramatically increase political risks for Russia as well.
Thank you. Let's hope that doesn't happen. Sabine, one last question. You had a wonderful thread on Twitter, and I advise everyone to follow Sabine on Twitter. She gives amazing insights. And this thread was analyzing the gender dimension of this conflict, and actually we've seen a general lack of women in the peace negotiations. This is a conflict made by men and not solved by men. Yet there is one person, one female politician, and Andrey mentioned it earlier, Angela Merkel, who could actually mediate between Moscow and Brussels. How would you see the likelihood of Merkel acting as a bridge in the future? Not necessarily right now, because I don't see these chances very high, but maybe in the future she could play a bigger role. How would you say?
Well, I think she would be terrific because, she is, I think, very apt and an extremely able mediator. I don't really think it's very likely that she will become involved, but you never know. We'll see. I wanted to say something about the gender dimension of this armed conflict, of this war in general, because I agree. And if you look at on the Russian side, and I would actually be very interested in also getting Andrey's view of that. But okay, I'm the woman, I get the gender question. Yeah. So yes, indeed. If you look at the Russian side, it's extremely male dominated, and also the imagery that is being produced in Russia by state television, by the Kremlin itself. If you think of Putin's meeting with the flight attendants, for instance, or also the Security Council meeting for the recognition of the two territories. Here Matvienko, the only woman that took the word during that meeting, of course, got the question about humanitarian suffering in the Donbas territory. So this is very typical, very male-dominated, paternalistic, if you like, image. I think it's difficult. It's not difficult. It's different on the Ukrainian side, where you have women fighting, women, taking part in the armed effort to defend cities, etc., etc. And you have a narrative about this, and Ukrainians also take pride in women playing that role. So I think we have very different gender relations or gender dimensions in Russia and in Ukraine with regard to this war.
Okay, just to be 100% clear, you got the question because you wrote the thread, but I want to ask the same question.
Sorry, I had to make that joke, sorry.
No, but you're right. We now must ask Andrey the same question. If you have any observations, please be short, because we're running out of time.
Well, I might be gender biased, but I think that the future of diplomacy belongs to women more than to men, because the future of diplomacy will depend a lot on empathy, on flexibility, on the ability to make compromises. And I think that the era of macho-type politicians is common to the end. It doesn't mean that males cannot demonstrate these qualities. I think that we can, but it's more typical for females to show that there is a way out of the most complicated situations, sometimes created by males.
Positive note, I'd like to thank our guests. It was indeed very short, so my hope is that you will accept another invitation from us in the near term. In the meantime, thank you so much for these amazing insights that you gave us in 30 minutes, and thank you everyone for following us, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.